accepted the invitation to join us tonight and to leave the SBL annual virtual meeting this year to be here with us tonight. So I'll first try to share my screen before I actually start the introduction. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'll introduce the topic and the main premises of the book so that you have an idea what it is about more generally. And then I'll give the word to the other speakers. So the book is called Conceptualizing Biblical Cities, and it is a study about cities in the Hebrew Bible. And one could wonder, why do a study on cities in antiquity? Are there actually cities to start with? So one of the first things you have to wonder about is actually the term itself, and the concept could be a problem. If we think of cities, we think of what you see here on these two images, big spaces, lots of people, dense population, high buildings, technology, and obviously these things weren't present in biblical times. Yet if we look at the Hebrew Bible itself, at the text, we do see that cities play a prominent role. And they play a role in two ways. On the one hand, they're places. On the other hand, they're characters in the story. And so as place, as location, they are both the actual location where events take place, but they're often also the backdrop against which things develop. If you think of a book such as The Song of Songs, which we associate mostly with nature, but the city always seems to be present somehow in that story. So that's one way in which cities play an important role in the text. The other element is that cities work as a character, so they play a role, and that's especially the case in the prophetic and more poetic books where the city is personified, and that counts for Jerusalem, but also for Babylon and Nineveh, for instance. And so if you take all these occurrences together, then you'll see that you cover quite some ground. So we can actually say that in some ways, the Hebrew Bible is a story about cities. So even though if we look outside the text and the material world, we may not have had real cities according to our modern definitions. In the text, we definitely had a city concept, and it played an important role. So this division between place and character, between location and person, is something we also see in research and scholarship that has been done on cities, on biblical cities. So what you see actually is that, and I seem to have a problem with, there we go, sorry. So what you see is that this place focus, you find it especially in historical and archaeological studies. The character focus is something you find in literary and theological studies, and that's obviously kind of a really rough divide, and there's studies that do try to mix them, but the majority seems to be categorized in those two different tracks. And the reason for that is obvious. They have a very different focus, they ask very different questions, and as a result, they look at very different passages in the text. And it takes quite a while for that to change. And the big change kind of came with what is called the spatial turn in humanities. It's a shift in scholarship where the attention moves from time and from history to space. And so space all of a sudden becomes very important, and researchers start looking into it, also biblical researchers, and especially the theory called critical spatiality, which is a social theory, is adopted. And this theory basically says, well, we have material space, which is what historians are interested in. We have a literary space, we have ideas about space, things where architects are interested in, drawings, but we also have use, we have experience of space. And that's something they thought was lacking, and they thought it was a way of bringing the two different approaches together. And so they kind of develop a new way of thinking about space, and that leads to new studies and new insights. This idea was also kind of influenced by the cognitive turn, which is a turn where one turns to cognition and to the mind, because there one also had a renewed like a reassessment of space, in the sense that one realized that a lot of our thinking and a lot of our language is embodied and is spatially informed. So it kind of came from two different directions. When I wanted to do my study on cities, my main question actually was, what is a city according to the Hebrew Bible, according to the text? And so I thought that this theory of critical spatiality was really interesting because it made it focused on different aspects of space. But one of the main criticisms, and it's one that I share, is that this theory didn't really focus on text. It wasn't really textual. It was trying to transpose a theory that was social to a text, to something literary. And as a result, it seems to like underestimate the power of language and underestimate the role of imagination. We can talk and write about spaces that do not exist at all. We can live in a very small village and write about it as if it's like the biggest city ever. So, and that's something this theory didn't take into account and didn't really acknowledge. So when I developed my framework for my study, I used critical spatiality and the tripartite division as the backbone, as the background, but I rendered it more textual, more stylistic. So for me, the material space became the language itself, everything that's in the text, the words, the expressions, the word order, so grammatical linguistic features, motion verbs, but also elements that have been called literary before, like parallelism, the use of literary metaphor. So anything that you can, as a reader, actually point out in the text. And if you were having like scissors, you could cut it out. So it's really the materiality of your text. And then as a second level about the ideas, I turned to conceptual metaphors. Conceptual metaphors are metaphors that underlie passages, so they do not overlap with literary metaphors. So for instance, when you have a passage where the city is talking and with God, and God calls her unfaithful, then nowhere in the text it says the city is a woman, but yet that's what everybody understands what it is about. So that's the underlying idea, that's your conceptual metaphor. So that was my second level. And then I went to the third level, which I called the cityscape. That's actually the grand picture you get in the end. So that's the what your story does with it. That's your narrative. And that is highly influenced by a device called framing, because as a writer, you select the images and the words that are useful for you to get your message across. And you aim at a certain effect. You want to like direct your reader in a certain direction. And so those are the three levels, and they're all part of the text. So, which doesn't mean that my approach is detached from reality, because the whole idea of cognitive stylistics is that language is embodied and necessarily influenced by the environment and the reality. But the whole reasoning, the whole way I kind of approach space comes from within the text, and it is built up from that text. So then in my further study, you'll see that my book is structured according to the main ideas. So according to the conceptual metaphors. So after the chapter in which I introduce my methodology, I have 7 chapters in which I describe 7 images for the city, 7 conceptual metaphors. And I basically just started reading the text and started notice, like every time I came across a passage that talked about cities, I wondered, what is the concept? So if I have to like make this equation, the city is X, what would the X be? And so after a while, after reading a few chapters, I noticed that certain concepts seem to reappear. And so I, for instance, had like images like a cup, a plate, a hammer. And then all of a sudden I saw like, oh, these are all objects. And then I had images as daughter, mother, bride, sister, and I was like, oh, these are all women. So, and that's how I started grouping the images, and I ended up with 7. And the surprising thing is that almost all passages that I selected, and I don't say there are any others, there could be others that I overlooked, but all the passages that I looked at fit within those 7, except for a few. And if you look at the ones that fall out, you see that the point there is exactly to break through the conceptual frame that everybody knew. So it's really there, the point really is to come with new ideas and new conceptualization. So it's really breaking through these 7 images you have. So that's how I ordered my book. And so the 7 images I came up with, you see them here. So they're person, animal, body, building, container, object, and height. And the way I ordered them in the book is random and not random. It's random in the sense that it doesn't represent the frequency or the importance of the image, of the metaphor. It's not because I first discussed person that's the most important metaphor. On the contrary, if you would kind of go for frequency, then probably container would be the one that appears most often. The point of like putting them in this way was just kind of to show that there's a connection between them, and that it's these 7 metaphors together that make up the concept rather than one of them. And you also see that if you look at larger chunks of text, that there are several metaphors within these stories and narratives. So it's not that you'll find only one of them. The person metaphor, very often a woman, is the part that has been discussed very elaborately in research before. And it's one of the ideas that's out there about cities in the Hebrew Bible, that they're women, or they're portrayed as women. So that was a chapter that was like easy to write because there was a lot of information, a lot of scholarship, but it was also difficult to kind of like try to like approach it objectively again, because there were so many ideas out there already. What I tried to do there was make a distinction between personification more generally and the gendering of that image. And you see that it's not always the case that it's gendered. And with the gendering, you really see the cognitive process present, where you really transfer a gendered item to a whole chapter or a whole book even. So it's really this cognitive process going on, and it's the reader making the associations rather than the text saying that the image is gendered. And then within that chapter, I also discussed the subtypes of all the female characters. I show what they add to the story. For instance, I stress the fact that it's about relationality rather than inferiority, which is one of the arguments that's out there. And then I conclude the chapter with a discussion about conquesting cities and the conquesting of women, which is a very problematic image, has been picked up in scholarship a lot. And so I show that there are some nuances to it. And one of the nuances is that you have 6 other images. For each of the other images, I describe what their main traits are. So why they're important, what they bring to the table for a writer when he or she uses this image. I discussed them with various examples. I've tried to use a lot of examples and from various books to show that there's really a coherent city image in the Hebrew Bible. And that kind of goes beyond what an individual writer or time prescribed. And I think with these different examples, I could illustrate that because they were present in all these different chapters and books. That's for like the 7 images. And then finally, in my final chapter, I try to come back from this detailed study because it's very often very detailed, or case studies. I come back to this more general level of the concept of the city. So if we bring all that back to that more broader concept, what are we talking about? And then you basically see that obviously a city is not a person or it's not a woman, but what we're talking about is that we're talking about something that's unified. We talk about something it's a relational entity with agencies. Those are the traits that are important on a conceptual level. Likewise, with the body, we're talking about change, about something that can change. With building, the building metaphor refers to the man-made aspects of a city. A container is about setting boundaries. So I really kind of try to connect for each of these metaphors what it means on a broader conceptual level. And I also make the link with modernity because our definitions of cities are very often modern. And so what you see is that if you look for the concepts there, you'll see that there is a lot of overlap. So most of the metaphors that you find in the biblical text are still valid nowadays. We're still saying New York, the never sleeping city, for instance, which is a personification. And we say, oh, the city's full of noise, which is a container metaphor. So we still draw on the same metaphors, which shouldn't surprise because we're still human beings in our human body, and we still experience the world in the same way, although we're living in a very different world. Which I thought was kind of surprising. I thought maybe there was like a very peculiar metaphor that would have died by now, but apparently not. Then in my conclusion, I also come back to what I call the state of the art that I discussed at the beginning of the book. And there you'll find three claims, and I already touched upon one, namely that people say cities in the Hebrew Bible are women, they're female. So I show in my book that they can be persons in general, so they can be just humans, and they can even be non-personified, they can be objects or heights. So that claim doesn't really stand according to me. The other idea that's out there in scholarship is that according to the Bible, cities are bad. So there's this very negative evaluation of the urban in the Hebrew Bible. And again, I do not agree. The whole notion of or the negative idea, the evil city idea is part of the framing. So you'll find it in the narrative, but in the concept itself, you will not find it. The concept is neutral. You can use it in a good or a bad way. And what's especially not true is that they're evil women. So combining the two ideas, because if we're talking about evil cities, you'll see that they're bad women, but they're also empty containers. Their heights brought low, they're destroyed objects, they're empty containers. So every single metaphor can be used in a negative or a positive way. And so it's not only the women metaphor. And then finally, the final claim is that all the cities in the Hebrew Bible represent Jerusalem. So there's actually only one city. I think there's still a way you can justify that, but I suggest an additional way of approaching that issue by saying that the reason they look alike is not because they're all Jerusalem, but because they're all cities. So they share the concept, and that naturally leads to the same metaphors. And what you see then on the level of the cityscaping is that you'll get a dialogue and you get a discussion among different books where authors consciously pick up a narrative that's developed, a cityscape that's developed in one book, and then they'll either reverse it or they do something with it. But that doesn't make the places the same, I think. So that's where I went with the book, and I hope I made a good case for that. It was a lot of fun to do it, for sure. So I think I'll leave it to that, and I'm really excited to hear the next speakers now. Back to you.
Vivian, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Okay, so now, first of all, Karolien, thank you so much. You hear me now?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So I now introduce Peter Machinist, who is the Hancock Research Professor of Hebrew and other Oriental languages in the Department of Near Eastern Languages at Harvard University. His primary interest is in the cultural, intellectual, and social history of the ancient Near East, focusing particularly on the connection between ancient Israel, the Hebrew Bible, and ancient Mesopotamia. Research topics include the ideology of imperialism and other forms of group identification, ancient historiography, mythology, prophecy, Assyrian history, and the history of modern biblical and other Near Eastern scholarship. His article, Assyria and its Image in the First Isaiah, is a classic in the field. Thank you so much, Professor Machinist, and please take the screen.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good.
Well, it's my honor and pleasure to be here this evening with you, at least virtually, and to honor the publication of Dr. Karolien Vermeulen's book. It was my pleasure and benefit to have worked with Dr. Vermeulen at Harvard when she was a postdoctoral fellow with us several years back. And I'm delighted for the opportunity to renew that contact this evening. Let me start by asking the question what the book is about and what it is not about. I'd like to start with what it is not about, at least as I read it. And in doing so, I'm going to look at the book as a whole, but as you will see later, I will focus on certain parts of it more particularly. This is not a conventional study of the city in biblical Israel, at least as earlier carried out by scholars like Volkmar Fritz, John Rogerson, or Frank Frick. It has little to nothing to do with the historical, physical reality of cities in ancient Israel, as Fritz and Frick. Sounds like a comedy team, but they really are separate people. As they work things out. Dr. Vermeulen also does not spend a lot of time talking about the terminology in the Hebrew Bible for cities or any other group habitations. She does mention them and talk about them, but not in a systematic way. She doesn't talk in any serious way about the cultures elsewhere in the ancient Near East that have to do with urbanism. There is essentially little or even nothing about ancient texts besides the Hebrew Bible, which is her focus, either texts from ancient Israel itself found archaeologically or elsewhere in the ancient Near East. There's very little, if anything, about the non-urban world that the Hebrew Bible refers to and that is been explored archaeologically in ancient Israel. And finally, there is no diachronic or very little concern with giving you a diachronic picture of the way cities are talked about in the Hebrew Bible. Is there any development of thought? She certainly is aware of this problem and touches on it, particularly in her conclusion, but chooses not to deal with it. Now, that list of nots is not meant to be necessarily a criticism, but rather an effort to provide what she herself deals with at another point of boundaries for her study. What does she do? Well, she's very eloquently summarized that in the presentation that just preceded mine. Let me, from my own point of view, say that I think in focusing on the Hebrew Bible itself, Dr. Vermeulen offers us a study of the biblical imagining or conception of the city as such, as a type, with a particular focus on Jerusalem, although not by any means an exclusive focus. She works, as she has pointed out, in the framework of recent studies on the field of spatiality and of memory, and more broadly of the imagining of realities, as these are all poured into the Hebrew Bible. And in this regard, as she has told us, she lays out what she thinks are the parameters of the ways in which the biblical authors thought about cities. Let me briefly review these in a slightly different way from what Dr. Vermeulen has just discussed. As she points out, she finds 7 major ways in which the city was imagined in the biblical corpus: as woman, animal, body, building, container, object, and height. These for her offer illuminating images, lodestones, or nexus points with different perspectives that can be overlapping, contradictory or oppositional, or similar or parallel. In turn, the 7 images themselves can overlap, intertwine, even in the same text or the same paragraph unit. Since Vermeulen draws these 7 from a variety of Hebrew biblical texts, differing in genre, subject matter, canonical placement, perhaps date of composition, although as I've said, she does not get into this in any serious detail, she wants to show that the 7 images reflect an essentially unitary, coherent view of the city, what it is, what it was, what it could be, across the fabric of the Hebrew Bible. And her concluding chapter, chapter 10, brings the 7 images together, I think lucidly and effectively, into a coherent arrangement, highlighting their interconnections and offering a closure to the symmetrical structure of the book itself, which has 2 introductory chapters, then 7 chapters for each of the 7 images, 7 brides for 7 grooms, as it were, and a conclusion to tie the knot of togetherness. She tries to show then that all the descriptions and references to cities have a single multifarious but essential core of a city which could be understood as either Jerusalem writ large, or as she prefers, an image in which Jerusalem is perhaps just one point in the analysis. To these 7 images, as arranged as I discussed, she also points out and discusses in the presentation you've just heard, a way of looking at these 7 spatially, adopting a trifold perspective put out by other theorists, which she adapts to the study not of physical reality, as she says, but rather to the way the images are displayed in the Hebrew Bible. And this spatial analysis works through 3 planes or 3 spheres, a first, a second, and a third, which in turn adaptation of such planes from other studies, but normally applied to physical reality and imagined reality. She applies then these 3 planes, first, second, and third, to particular biblical texts about the city in order to illuminate what it is that the biblical authors are trying to say in terms of their urban perspectives. This analysis I find inventive and imaginative, and at its best, it indicates and illuminates the multi-level, multi-sided perception of the city which the Hebrew Bible projects. The analysis, in short, explicates and supports an underlying theological premise that pervades more implicitly than explicitly on the subject of God and space in the Bible. As Vermeulen puts it, and I quote, "One way to read the Hebrew Bible is as a narrative of space, not only in the literal sense that people move to and from the promised land, but also metaphorically, as one in which the biblical God is claiming his space amidst other gods, other cultures, and even across time and space. Indeed," she goes on, "God rules over all the space. He is everywhere. He is the space." Now, some of you can well imagine that this kind of formulation cannot fail to recall a prominent classical rabbinic name for God, the precedent for which may be found in the 1st century CE Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, that God is Hamakom, the place. And here we have, I think, a very interesting set of arguments for showing you the biblical basis for this Second Temple and later rabbinic formulation of Makom. Naturally, of course, if one is to be a reviewer or a critic, one has to find areas in which questions may be raised and even critical comments offered. So let me, in the few moments that I have, raise several things with you. In the first place, I think this first, second, and third space delineation works reasonably well for the first and second. The first referring, at least in terms of the biblical text, as I understand Vermeulen, the first refers to wordings that have a place in the outside physical reality, a description of a city, for example, in terms of the actual buildings that might be there. The second space would be the metaphorical formulations based on something of the first, but not necessarily so. So here we get the 7 images of the city, for example, as a woman, or the city as a container. The third space is where I have the most difficulty. Vermeulen comes back to this at several different points in her analysis, and perhaps most clearly at the end on pages 229 and 230. But even there, I still have some difficulty differentiating it, often from the second space. The third space seems to be some larger background, or as she calls it, framework, in which the first and second spaces are discussed. In this way, to show that a given biblical text may in fact be operating through all 3 spaces. Perhaps the best way to see how it would work positively is to take one of her examples, which is the book of Jeremiah, chapter 50, verses 14 to 16, where the depiction there is of God announcing the punishment of the city of Babylon for its sins. As Vermeulen shows, this short description moves through several of the 7 major images: the city as container, as a building, and finally as a person. In other words, all of the second space, all then within the overarching field or third space, or what she calls cityscape, of a payback or retaliation, namely, as she says, what the city has done to others in terms of serving as a container or as a monumental building or as a bad person, will now be done to her. So the third space is some sort of background against which physical representation and metaphoric representation are put out. But I'd like to suggest that this perhaps needs a little more clarity than at least I was able to read into her work. I mentioned earlier that Vermeulen forswears largely a diachronic view. That is to say, an attempt to argue that there are different images of the city in the Hebrew Bible, which can be dated to certain points in the compositional history of that Bible, or even of the larger history of Israel, from which the Bible, of course, comes. She has probably good reason to not to try to dip too deeply into the quagmire of dating biblical texts, something that only God will resolve, I think, when the kingdom finally arrives. Nonetheless, she also avoids diachronic analysis, she says, because she finds essentially a unitary or at least coherent view of the city, as I mentioned, across all the biblical texts that she looks at. Yet I think there are a number of questions here that remain unanswered. Is the city, depending on how one defines it, I'll come to that in a moment, something that is there in the biblical presentation of the earliest history of Israel, let's say the history before the monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon appears? Is there something about cities which is tied at least to the biblical memory of how the history of Israel has developed? This kind of question is not mentioned. All that we really get is a reference toward the end of her book that diachronic analysis is something perhaps for a future volume. And she mentions there one suggestion, which frankly I find unhelpful, but we can get into that perhaps in the discussion. Let me mention a couple of other areas where I think some work would have been helpful. As I mentioned, her focus, of course, is on the city. There really is very little discussion of the non-city materials, which perhaps are more than outweighed by the city, but nonetheless, rural phenomena do appear. Perhaps the most striking is the story of the Rechabites, a kind of back to the woods group who disdain living in large urban affairs. And what does that mean? At least some touching on rural matters would have helped, I think, to define more precisely what it is that the biblical authors find so central in their lives as they depict it in the city. And here we run into another issue which Vermeulen decides to avoid in any serious way, some kind of comparison, as I mentioned, with non-biblical cultures of the ancient Near East. Mesopotamia, for example, is also a civilization whose major written remains are largely urban. When non-urban folks or regions are talked about, they are often talked about in negative ways, not comparing to the enlightened world of the city. Do we have something of that order in the Bible? I don't think so from a very rough impression, but I think an analysis of at least a bit of that would have helped. One or two other points, and then I will conclude. What about the origin of the whole issue of the city as a woman, which was the longest chapter in the book? And therefore, I would have to say that despite Dr. Vermeulen's sense that it may not be the most important, we don't know because she hasn't given us statistical study of this. Certainly, the notion of the city as a woman is very important to her because it's far and away, as I said, the longest chapter. Now, it's interesting that grammatically, as she points out, the word city, the main word for city, ir in Hebrew, is in feminine in grammar. And that may play a role in the way the city is imagined as a woman. It's interesting in Mesopotamia that the main word in the Semitic language of Mesopotamia, called Akkadian, the word alu is masculine. So we do not have, so far as I'm able to see, any material coming from Mesopotamia in which the city is talked about as a woman or personified in some sort of way. Is this something of larger civilizational significance? It may be. It may align, for example, with the fact that one of the major gods of Mesopotamia, the sun god Shamash, a word meaning sun, is masculine. But the same word in the West Semitic world, the world of the ancient Levant, of ancient Syria and Palestine, of which Israel is a part, that sun god is called Shapshu or Shapsh, and this god is feminine, is a goddess. Are we dealing with some kind of cultural divide here into which the whole issue of the city has to be placed? And finally, I would mention the whole issue of the definition of the city. How can one recognize a city in the biblical text in terms of what the authors want? The 7 images that Dr. Vermeulen gives us could help here, but they don't really, in my judgment, serve to define a phenomenon called a city such that one could recognize it. Terminology may not help either because, as she properly points out, the main word ir apparently is used for what we might call towns as well as cities. This whole issue of defining a city, therefore, I think needs some work. Let me conclude with a couple of comments about the close reading of biblical texts, which she offers to us in plentiful fashion. And I mentioned Jeremiah 50, 14 to 16 as one small example of how she's able to deconstruct in terms of the way the images work on the three planes, so that we get a sense of how the biblical author is working in that Jeremiah passage to put it together. Here I'd like to just put on the screen one point that will help to explain what I'm going to conclude with. Could we put that on? Let's go down to the latter part of it just in terms of time. Lamentations 1:1 and Isaiah 60. Both of these texts find their way into Dr. Vermeulen's long and wide-ranging study. In the case of Lamentations, she wants to argue that this opening of the book addresses the city as a person, but as a non-gendered person. Alas, in this translation, lonely sits the city. Echa yashva vadad ha'ir. Now, yashva is a verb in the feminine singular, third person, to go with the city. Does that automatically gender the city? This becomes a major issue for Vermeulen, as it rightly should. Is gender here just simply a grammatical marker, or does it have semantic significance? What Vermeulen wants to argue with regard to Lamentations, and something similar is in Isaiah 61-9, is that the grammatical gender feminine there is not sufficient to mark the image of the city as feminine. In the case of the Lamentations text, that only starts with the third line, once great with people. It's not the best translation, but let's leave it at that. Once great with people, she that was great among nations has become like a widow, the princess among states. So Vermeulen's argument is that only in the latter part of this long first verse is explicit identification of the city, in this case it's the city Jerusalem, granted gendered status as a widow and as a princess. I just wonder whether she's pushing things too far here. And that the fact that we start with the city lonely sitting, and the verb sitting here is feminine, is designed as a marker forward to the next lines, which are arranged in a very tight structural way, which the translation unfortunately doesn't reproduce, as the markers grow on you. And I would rather not see the first line as non-gendered, but as a marker of gender, which grows in elaboration as this whole verse is laid out for us. In the Isaiah 60 passage, here we don't have any explicit marker in the first 9 verses, really on into 10, which I've given you. Rather, we have the city addressed again with the feminine gender, which is grammatical, but the insistence on this grammar, this feminine grammar, in the second person. Arise, shine, for your light has dawned. The presence of the Lord has shone upon you. Behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick clouds the peoples, and upon you the Lord will shine. Again and again and again, the author is coming back to you, and all the yous are second person feminine, singular. This suggests to me that this is more than just simply the city addressed as a person with gender undefined, but rather with gender defined, by playing on the grammar of the language. That I'm even asking these questions is the achievement of Dr. Vermeulen. She has provoked me to rethink passages that I have long read, some of which I have not paid as much attention to as I should. And therefore, I want to congratulate her as I conclude my review for a very thoughtful piece of study and analysis. Truly a provocative work to read. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Machinist. We are now coming to our next speaker, Talia Sutskover. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Biblical Studies at Tel Aviv University. Her main fields of research are literary and cognitive approaches to the Hebrew Bible, semantic fields, categorization, schemata, the senses in biblical literature, biblical Hebrew, space theory, and Akkadian mythology. She's the author of Sight and Insight in Genesis, a semantic study. Talia, please.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for this introduction. Can you hear me? Can people? Okay. I will read from my papers, but I want to firstly to thank Karolien for inviting me for allowing me to read this book and for commenting on it, my personal thoughts. So thank you for inviting me tonight. For me, it's night. I see Peter is sitting in daytime, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it's 10 p.m. here in Israel, but we're still awake. So I believe that one of the most telling criteria of an excellent research is whether it triggers the reader into a thinking and developing mode with regard to the topic under discussion, or better yet, with regard to his or her own topic of research. Following Peter's last comment. This was the case for me when reading Vermeulen's volume, Conceptualizing Biblical Cities. The benefits of reading this excellent study are already felt while reading through the introductory discussions in chapters 1 and 2, Shaping the City Textually and the City for Starters, as the work offers a deep and extensive bibliography assessment regarding no less than 3 different domains: spatial studies, the biblical city, and metaphors. And there are more issues she deals with in her bibliography survey. I liked Vermeulen's remark in chapter 2, page 27. Let me share the screen. I hope I can. There's a PowerPoint presentation. As I said, I liked Vermeulen's remark in chapter 2 about her finding the prevailing definitions regarding metaphors and urban space too confining, as is often the case when research starts off. Analyzing biblical metaphors will rarely include tracing and following a single metaphor. Rather, Vermeulen explains, the biblical narrator will often use 2 or more metaphors in a single verse describing the city. For instance, we have here Nahum's prophecy of Nineveh's pending destruction. This description includes the metaphors: the city is a container, the city is a building with gates, and a person with enemies. We can read this together. Behold, your people in your midst are women. To your enemies, the gates, She'arei Artzech, of your land, have surely opened themselves. Fire has consumed your gate bars. הנה עמך נשים בקרבך לאויבייך, פתוח נפתחו שערי ארצך, אכלה אש בריחייך. So we have three metaphors here, which is very nice to see. This refining of the current view of metaphors is most useful. And on page 144, Vermeulen also explains the value of tracing these combined metaphors. She says, the shifts between metaphors reveal that the city is a complex being only to be understood through multiple metaphors. Vermeulen notes the combined metaphors in Tzfania 3:11 and 12. I have it here. This is in chapter 9 of her book, which may serve as an opportunity to show the type of analysis she does in her book, she offers in her study. Let's see what we can learn from this verse. On that day, you will not be ashamed of all your deeds by which you rebelled against me. For then I will take away from within you the exalting ones of your pride, and you will no longer be high on my sacred mountain. ביום ההוא לא תבושי מכל עלילותייך אשר פשעת בי, כי אז אסיר מקרבך עליזי גאוותך, ולא תוסיפי לגובהה עוד בהר קודשי. What is interesting here is that the personified city and her inhabitants are described with height vocabulary, expressing the underlying ideas that the city is a person, a container, and a high place. This height is not permanent. God will remove the proud people, Alizei Gavatech, and the city as a whole will no longer be identified as high. Instead of a reversal from high to low, Tzfania combines the height metaphor with the container metaphor. The answer to height is not lowness, but removal and emptiness, an unexpected and powerful description, in my view. Moving on to another type of metaphors, chapter 3, the personified city, shows that in certain contexts, the city is conceived as God's wife. So I think that if the city is considered as God's wife, it can align, or it joins. The city now joins to, I thought of two other wives God has, right? We have Eve. Some would consider Eve as God's wife, and there's wisdom, which is also described as God's wife. So it's interesting to see that we have three elements in the Bible which function as God's partner, and the city is one of them. Though the description of the city as God's wife, through the description of the city as God's wife, the reader is given a key to a realm never fully developed in the Hebrew Bible, the realm of a long-term marriage relationship. Since I give in Israel, in Tel Aviv University, one of my courses deals with or discusses familial family relations in the Hebrew Bible, that was an interesting point to me, the city as wife. So since so through the depiction of the city as God's wife, we can learn about marriage relationships, long-term marriage relationship in the Bible, through the yes, in the Bible. As a matter of fact, it is only through the metaphor of city is wife that we gain insight into the range of emotions between husband and wife from the point of view of the husband. The Song of Songs, right, tells us or describes two, I think, young lovers. They're not married yet. We have Amnon, who loves Tamar, his sister. They are not married, and this love soon turns into hatred, as we all know. And we have other male characters who love female characters, usually because they're pretty, or yes, it's a very short description, but we don't know what goes on in a long-term marriage relationship. So let's explore this through the metaphor of the city is wife or as wife. So let's see Isaiah 54, 6-10. For as a wife deserted, you're blocking my verse. I'm going to move you. Okay. For as a wife deserted and grieved, the Lord has called you back. Ki che'isha azuva ve'atzuvat ruach kra'ach Adonai. The wife of his youth, can she be rejected? Said your God, ve'eshet neurim ki tima'es amar Elohecha. For a little moment I forsook you, berega katon azavtich. But with great mercy I will bring you back. In an outburst of anger, I hid my face for a moment from you, but with kindness forever I have compassion with you, said your Redeemer the Lord. Etc. You have it here. This metaphoric passage depicting the relationship between God and the city as his wife informs us about the emotional changes the husband experiences. He admits that he left her for a moment. It is translated this way in the English versions, but I prefer in a moment, right? We have here berega katon azavtich. So it seems like he's describing the fact that he didn't think about his leaving. It happened. It seems it happened in a spur of a moment. She is in an emotional state of great sadness, and he is aware of this. Can the husband come back to his forsaken wife? Yes. But interestingly, it is not because he loves her. According to Isaiah, the husband is overwhelmed by feelings of pity towards the wife of his youth. He also admits that his anger at her has taken control over him, also in an instant. But he is filled with mercy and wants to take her back. The reader is reassured that the husband has promised not to be angry with his wife ever again and to remain her spouse forever. We may thank metaphors of the city for shedding some light on marriage relations in the Hebrew Bible, because these are never discussed explicitly. And rather than dismissing this argument, saying that God and the city cannot represent regular human relations, I suggest to think of them as the prototypes of human relations, or even as archetypes of human relations. Why not? And perhaps women in the Hebrew Bible would like to be considered as cities. See, for instance, Genesis 16:2, right? Sarah offers Abraham Hagar, her maidservant, and she expresses that by saying, perhaps I can build a family through her, right? She ulai ibane mimena. She this is again the metaphor of maybe it can be considered as the metaphor of city as a building, or woman as building. The vertical city. It was interesting to see how physical height and mental height are often intertwined in the metaphor, the city is height. We can see this, for instance, in Psalms 48:2-3. Great is the Lord and much praised in the city of our God. Gadol Adonai umehulal me'od, his holy mountain, Be'ir Eloheinu har kodsho. His holy mountain, lovely in height, joy of all the earth, Mount Zion, remote part of Tzafon, city of a great king. Mountains are high, and joy is metaphorically height. The verses try to bridge the gap between earthly and divine realms through the notion of the city, which is both a mountain and a joy of all the earth. The attribute of height, we can see how it occurs here throughout the description. There is the lexeme har, which is a mountain. There is nof, elevation, joy, masos, and perhaps height can be understood in the adjective rav, as Vermeulen suggests. What about David? David, in the scene of in 2 Samuel 11:2, is depicted in an urban environment, in an urban surrounding. One evening, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. So all this elevation, all these elevation words maybe symbolize David's state of mind. I think that is what Vermeulen suggests, because if he's standing on a rooftop, it tells something about David himself, his thoughts, his emotional state. He has an overview of the special order, a privileged position given to him in his role as leader. The high location, or David's high location, says Vermeulen, evokes positive feelings, David's emotional state at the moment. Perhaps this was, I liked this idea, and it also made me think about Saul, the King Saul, who is also described in an urban, using urban lexemes. He's anointed on a bama, a high place, And after he is anointed, perhaps we remember that situation. After he's anointed, he spends some time with Samuel on the roof. Other elevated terms of elevation are also connected to Saul. We know that he comes from or his city, his home city is Giv'ah, which means hill. And Saul himself is, right, he's the highest character around. So I was wondering, Karolien, what we can discuss this afterwards, but what are we going to do with Saul, who is surrounded by elevated lexemes and even urban elevated lexemes of elevation, but we know his mood is very low or down. So this was a problem for me, and I would like to discuss afterwards.
Thanks.
Yes, am I done? Okay, so thank you for this fascinating analysis of the concept of city in the Hebrew Bible, and thank you for showing us ways to develop our own research in light of your analysis and findings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talia. I'm now introducing our last speaker. Jacqueline Vayntrub is Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale University. Her areas of expertise include the Hebrew Bible, wisdom literature, biblical poetry and poetics, philology, and the history of biblical scholarship. She is especially interested in the Hebrew Bible's genres and modes of discourse against the broader background of ancient Near Eastern literary production and its reception in and impact on Western scholarship. She's the author of Beyond Orality, Biblical Poetry on Its Own Terms. Jacqueline, please.
Thank you so much. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. So first of all, I wanted to thank you, Karolien, for the opportunity to read this book and share my thoughts. I wanted to begin with explaining how much I enjoyed reading this work. It's not only well written and insightful, it's also very clearly an expression of your scholarly voice, which is refreshingly unburdened by theological or ideological commitments. So it is here that I would like to start with my praise for your approach to the biblical texts, which is not just literary and not simply cognitive stylistic, but an effort to think conceptually through puzzles that are presented by the texts. Reading your book, I feel as if I found a partner to think with. So as I have said, your approach appears to be so clearly unburdened by theological and ideological commitments. And for this reason, the kinds of questions you pose of the text are different than perhaps the ones that many others in the field would. And it is this that results in such a work. As you write, the book has two starting points: that there is a coherent city concept that one can excavate and recover from the biblical texts, and that language is a tool that is used to construe space. Language, as you write, is, quote, itself spatial by definition. It's the thingness of language corresponds to and represents the thingness of our experiences. This coherent city concept arises in these different, 7 different metaphors, one of the most dominant of which you identify as the city as a container. And this is in fact a startlingly simple idea, but it's incredibly productive, incredibly productive way to make sense of the different literary expressions of the city in the biblical literary tradition. It is in this way that you can cut through the blinders that we have on when reducing this coherent city concept to, for example, a simply gendered notion of the city as a woman, because as you show, it is a necessary observation of the text, but it is by no means a sufficient one. The city is or can be personified as a woman in the text for many reasons, not least of which, as you mentioned, that they are grammatically marked as feminine. Because of how Hebrew marks its verbs and adjectives for gender, a personified city who is acting is going to be acting in a grammatically marked way that marks for gender. As you write, quote, the presence of feminine forms and endings for cities in the text facilitates an identification of the personified city as woman. What you so clearly show in your study is that even when a city is feminized, personified as a woman, it is not its gendering that is the generative component of its personification, but rather its acquisition of person. As you write in your description of Ezekiel 23, throughout that chapter, quote, throughout that chapter, cities are presented as siblings, as wives, adulteresses, mothers, and whores. All city women indeed have one element in common. They share a notion of relationality. The gendering of the city is a de facto socializing of the city that has taken place already through its rendering as a body in space. The city as a body in space, as a person, is socialized through a set of ideas of relationships and social order. It's for this reason that a study of the city can be so generative, because through the ways the biblical authors conceptualize the city, we can learn much of their own ideas of the political, the social, the anthropological, the aesthetic, and the phenomenological. And so for the remainder of my time with you, I want to think with this book and explore an idea that, at least for me, is an incipient one, that has been inspired by this book. So I'd like to pick back up on a point you make at the very beginning of the book on page 4, quoting Christopher Meredith's 2013 work, Journeys in the Songscape, Space and the Song of Songs, that, quote, analysis of literary space is not simply a matter of our affirming that space is textual and then reading, but of realizing that text is spatial and then exploring. Further, you write, quote, what is more, this literary imagination is assisted by language that is itself spatial by definition. I would like for us to think about how the biblical authors might have understood bodies, cities, and texts in the same breath, how literary and text production is not in fact removed from other ways of thinking about the world and not removed from their ways of thinking about cities or animals or people as bodies. We find, of course, overlapping metaphors of the city in biblical texts, as you so carefully point out. One metaphor for the city is that it is a container. Another is that the city is a body or the city is a person. Another is gendered, that the city is a woman. We could say that what is particularly interesting about the way in which the city is a person and the city is a woman metaphors work in the Hebrew text is that personification in this literary culture is one that entails embodiment. Like the city, the body is visualized or conceptualized as a container. So, what if we were to think of the text also as a container, or how the text could be understood and analyzed spatially? We, of course, tend to think of manuscripts as maybe now two-dimensional, since these days we consume them in an entirely two-dimensional space. But of course, and now we're actually meeting in two-dimensional space too, which is bizarre. But of course, texts were not consumed in this way in antiquity. As Avram Rochek has shown, texts from Jewish antiquity were not de facto bound or stable or cataloged. The words of texts and the legendary figures that speak these words require containers, strategies of binding and cataloging and attribution and anthologizing to contain them. There are a number of containers, attributive frames, poetic and voicing strategies that text can be placed in to contain them. And there is one that I would like to think about in light of your book, the so-called wasaf or body description poem. This, of course, this and other modes of body descriptions are poetic strategies you think about in the book. As you write about the cityscape in Nineveh in the book of Nahum, it is, quote, it is the body that ties together all of the different metaphors, both in terms of the conceptualization. The city is a woman, the city is an animal, the city is a container. A number of biblical texts demonstrate affinity for description that aims at encompassing the whole, usually a description of bodies, and usually these bodies are described in praise. And of course, a common example would be the praise of the woman's body in Song of Songs, chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. And there the poem moves through the different parts of the woman's body in a systematic fashion, concluding, all of you is beautiful, not a blemish on you. The type of poem in Song of Songs that describes the lover's body from head to toe is often identified by scholars as a wasf, which is a term borrowed from medieval Arabic poetics. In the biblical text, the wasf is a poetic strategy for expressing and containing the body as a text, and it is used to express a successful body, to attribute this body with order, a head-to-toe description of a body that makes a claim about wholeness and perfection. It's been suggested that what we identify as the wasf in biblical texts developed from descriptions of cult statues in the ancient Near East, and there's an entire literature from Mesopotamia in which the bodies of deities are described from head to toe or toe to head or from one extreme to another. The body description poem as a discourse of totality can and is extended in the biblical text to other entities. We have both written about the city ship of Tyre in Ezekiel 27, which is a fascinating example of the coalescing of the city as container and the city as a body and the city as a woman. I also wonder if West Semitic monumental inscriptions that feature the body and visage of the memorialized speaker can be a kind of material manifestation of the idea that is also generative in the city is a building metaphor, that the city, like an animate human body in the realm of the living, stands upright. So too is this idea operative in such memorial inscriptions, that it memorializes the speaker not as a deceased ancestor buried beneath the ground with his fathers, but instead occupies the space of the living in perpetuity. But I digress. I'd like to return to the idea of the body description poem as a strategy for containing the text as a body, not in fact unlike the strategy of such inscriptions I described that take up in their material inscribed object the form of a body, an upright, tall form. In this sense, where you have observed that the city descriptions in biblical literature are texts that describe bodies, the body description poems are bodies that shape and contain texts. It is the body itself that contains the words. This might sound bizarre and otherworldly, but if you ponder it for a moment, you might realize that in fact, such a way of rendering texts is completely understandable. Words are most commonly produced not by texts, but by bodies with voices. And we know from biblical wisdom and prophecy that words and instructions are believed not only to be the product of voices, but are contained and bounded in the inner space of the body, in the lev, commonly translated the heart or the mind. One such example of how the body acts as a container for the words of text, in this case a re-container for text, is the scroll that Yahweh commands Ezekiel to ingest, inscribed with the words of Kina, a lament that the prophet recites. These words are not Ezekiel's own or even those transmitted to him through oral father to son instruction, but already as a text. Even though one might assume that the text is already itself bounded by the material on which the words are inscribed, to be active and animate for the prophet, they must be swallowed and ingested for the body to envelop them and reanimate them to emerge again as words in the mouth of the prophet. I had also an example that I wanted to bring of what might be the opposite case of a body description used for an unbounded, uncontained text space. The Dead Sea Scrolls text 4Q184, The Wiles of the Wicked Woman, as the text is known, in which body parts are named out of any discernible order. Her heart weaves traps, her kidneys are defiled with iniquity, her hands take hold of the pit, her feet go down to do evil. Here it is not passive, observable body parts from head to toe, as in the wasf poems that we find in Song of Songs that attest to the body's perfection, but rather inner organs, or rather body parts that have quasi-independent agency, the so-called heart, or seat of cognition, and the kidneys. As Laura Quick has recently argued about this poem, while at first glance it appears that the poet has begun a list of body parts akin to the wasf, our expectations are immediately subverted. Instead, with these first two terms, the woman is rather disembodied. So, Karolien, you have written about how parts of the body connote spatiality. Here, I think we might see that 4Q184 uses a disordered body description to do something not only descriptive in expressing order, but textual as well. There's much more for us to explore in terms of how text production and artistic production intersected with understandings of speech, space, and bodies. But I'd like to just conclude by again thanking Karolien for this generative study on the city as it propels research to new directions and intersecting questions of ancient stylistics and phenomenologies.
Jacqueline, thank you so much. Thanks to all four of you for extremely rich presentations, which just so much to think about that from people outside of this field, this takes some time to process. I would like to know if there are maybe first reactions to each other. Karolien, maybe you want to respond briefly. Anyway, it is impossible to respond to everything that has been said here. But you know what, Karolien, I suggest that I ask if there are questions from the audience that I would collect and then give you the final word. Or do you think that would be a good way to go about it?
Yeah, probably.
So I maybe could start with a question so that you can, you know, if you have a question, you can ask it in the chat. And my question is to Karolien first. Karolien, you distinguished between, so I am not in this field. I was fascinated by the rigor of these reflections, and of course have been very impressed with Karolien's work for years. Karolien, when you distinguish between concept and story, so you talk, I think it was in the context of talking about city as a woman, but when you distinguish between, can you really do this completely?
Well, I mean, what I did in the book and in the analysis is kind of, you kind of take apart what actually belongs together. And then in my final chapter, I kind of put it back together. So things are really intertwined. But I think like on a meta level, you can take the concepts apart from the story. And the concepts are kind of, it's like a coloring box. So you have like your, what is it? Like the small ones, they have 12 pencils. And then you can make any drawing with it. You give it to 10 people and they come up with something very different. So, but the concepts or the ideas I saw, like, they're like more stable and more fixed than what you get in the precise expressions, which are called the words or the first space in the book, and the cityscape. So the stories you create, how you use your words and your ideas to come to a particular tale you want to tell. So in reality, obviously, I mean, when you read a text, they're all together in there. So they're not separate. And as a reader, you're also not really going to deconstruct it. And you're just gonna go with the metaphors and with the ideas that are there, which is one of the things that scholars have problematized when it comes to the violent depictions. Yes. Because readers kind of adopt them and they don't think like, oh, this is a metaphor and we shouldn't, you know, read this literally or something like that. So in reading, you wouldn't really separate them, but theoretically you can, I would say.
Thank you. Thanks, Karolien. Now, there is a question from someone who calls himself profane in this work, asking, do you also mean that theology is defining the space and not the necessity of humans?
I suppose that's about the sentence that has been mentioned about God claiming space.
Yes.
In my book, I approach God as a character. I'm trying to think. I think it may actually be in the introduction. where I kind of specify what I mean by when I use author, when I use God. So I mainly approach him as a character in the story. So it's not, I mean, it's not really a theological claim for me. It's a story claim or something like that. So that's what I meant with that claim. So.
Thank you, Karolien. Tom, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself? I see you here.
Okay, hi. Thanks to all the contributors. This has been so interesting. I really enjoyed everything you have to say, and thank you for your engagements with the text. It was really helpful for me. My question is, you introduced, Karolien, the presentation with a hesitation about the historical specificity of what city means to us, the contemporary audience and previous audiences. This makes sense, I think. Do you have a similar hesitation about the concept woman? So I can imagine that the phrase, the city is a woman, would have meant something different to audiences then and now. Is this something which is relevant to your research? If so, what shape did it take? Thank you again.
I didn't really problematize that in the way I did with the term city. Basically because my focus was on cities rather than on women. So my whole approach with the book was, there's all this scholarship out there about cities are women, but there's so much more going on in the Bible text. And so my focus really was on the city. And so the female personification was just one of the images. So I also didn't problematize object or height for that matter. So these are like the source domains of your metaphor. So, but what I wanted to talk about was the city, which is the target domain. Obviously you can problematize that. And I mean, people will understand, especially in the current society, where gender is far more fluid than it used to be. I think the discussions would be different, and maybe you should, like, you know, frame that, but I didn't in my book.
Thank you, Karolien. Maybe I don't see another question. I would like to ask one more, if I may, and I would like to, you know, allow you then to address the other speakers. I encountered the metaphor of the city as woman in completely different contexts. I'm a professor of German literature, mainly 19th, 20th century. And I dealt with this in terms of, you know, early feminist theories and the way they dealt with metaphor. And I didn't even know it existed in the Bible at the time. It's just all pervasive, and it's related to something you conquer, something you enter, something you woo, something you you make a siege, where you so there's a whole range of activities that were related to it. And I was wondering whether you looked at all into how this is, you know, just part of a, you know, of a very general cultural phenomenon, and whether there's anything that is specific to the Bible in how it does this differently from other you know, from other books and cultures.
Well, the whole idea is definitely embedded in the idea of the kind of equation of war and love. So there is an equation and a parallel, and that gives the images you're just describing, and it's also present in Hebrew Bible. Whether that would be something more general, like culturally, then I mean, you would have to look at a variety of sources to actually claim that, especially with the time difference. And But it's something interesting. I mean, what I personally found really interesting was that the 7 images I discuss in my book are all still present nowadays. So, I mean, I think and that's also what cognitive linguists say, some of the conceptual metaphors are almost universal in the sense that they appear in different languages, different cultures over time. Whereas others are very specific, and that's especially the case as soon as you go like to sub-levels, where metaphors seem to differ. But a lot of them are universal, and it has to do with the fact that no matter what language we speak or where we live or when we live, we have that human body and we experience what's going around us through that body. So obviously we come up with some of the same ideas.
Yes, thank you. You would like to address the speakers in some way? I know this is difficult.
Yeah, it's almost impossible, but I'll try to do my best. So I first like to thank you all for all the insightful comments, the criticism, the praise. I didn't expect it to be so elaborate, but I was very pleased, and it definitely gives me further food for thought and like, you know, follow-up ideas. As far as Peter's comments go, I'd like to specify one thing. So when he had like some difficulties with the framework. The problem, I guess, is that the original framework where you had the 3 types of space, the third space also has been problematized in later scholarship. It's kind of a blend of the first 2, and it's also more than it. So what people tried to do was to kind of go beyond the binary idea that was out there. And I think that was their way to do it. And obviously the social theory worked with real space. So we were talking, the experience would be an actual person walking through a real city. So their experience and use is more like palpable and more real. So when you transform that to text, it becomes something different. And at least I tried to explain that. But apparently at some points it could have been more clear, but there was kind of like, I wanted to offer case studies, but I couldn't. It's always this balance, like where do you stop? And but the third space has been a problem in theory itself, I think. So it has not always been as clear to people. As far as the lack for diachronic and like other missing things that weren't there, I think it's both. It's a conscious choice in the sense that I really wanted to focus, and I consider, and it's linked to the framework I use. So I consider stylistics and cognitive stylistics as a way to approach the text that may go before a diachronic study, or a theological study, or an ecological study, or any other interest you may have in the text, because it's interested in reading. So the first thing we do when we engage with the text is read it. And a lot of the interpretive frames come later on and kind of seem to skip the part where you actually read the text. And as I suggested in my conclusion, I think that there is definitely follow-up possibilities. And one of them is actually see what is the development throughout the text if we look at it chronologically or historically. I think it could be valid. So, so far for Peter's ideas and comments. Then I want to turn, just gonna switch some pages here, to Talia. So she brought like very different arguments to the fore, which I really liked. The suggestion that the city as a building was also present in the story where Sarah builds her family through Hagar, I thought was really interesting, because that brings up the idea, like, would bana then be like a verb to be tracked throughout the Bible, and see what's going on there. So is building families, how is that related to building a city? Especially in like the earlier stories in the book of Genesis, where there is almost nothing, right? Or at least not as far as we know. So I thought that was an interesting suggestion. The question about Saul, I have to look into that. I'm not sure what would be going on there with the elevation. As far as David went, I think what I wanted to show was that he is in this privileged position. So and then what he does is actually the contrary, right? So he doesn't behave as he should. I wouldn't say that he felt like really like happy or anything. I mean, but I should look into what Saul says and does to see if there's a contradiction in terms of space, what you were saying. So yeah, we can definitely pick that up later on, and I'm happy to discuss that. So, and then I'd like to conclude with what Jackie said. I was very pleased at a certain point when I was finalizing the book. I asked Jackie for her article on Tyre on Ezekiel 27, and I was very surprised to see like how much overlap there was, although we were approaching the text differently. I very much like the idea of thinking about body, cities, and text more closely. I do think that there is value to that, and that we should look into that more closely, especially with the idea of poetic frames and the spatial aspects of text on a material level. I didn't really consider that. I think in the introduction I mentioned there's like stylistic devices like parallelism, but that would be like on a small scale. I think what you were talking about is on a bigger scale. So that definitely offers, I think, opportunities for further research. Yeah, lots of ideas right now, but I think it's probably time to wrap up. And I give the last word to you, Vivian.
Oh, I just want to thank everybody for a very inspiring evening. I learned many things, and I'm sure that all of you are taking something with you. Thanks so much, those from abroad and far. We have to celebrate this possibility of uniting around such a fascinating topic, and above all, Karolien's book from many places in the world. Stay safe, stay inspired, and let's hope that we can meet in person out there in the real world.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody.